Don't bother calling unless she's dead. Those were the exact words my husband muttered to the emergency room staff while I was lying on the operating table, fighting for my life. I was supposed to be heading home from the military base for Thanksgiving, looking forward to a warm meal and the comfort of my own bed. Instead, a sudden medical emergency left me stranded in a sterile hospital room, completely alone. Or so I thought. What my husband didn't realize was that the doctor holding the phone wasn't just a random physician. He was someone from my husband's past, someone who knew exactly what kind of man he truly was. And when a hospital clerk walked into my room 2 days later with a mysterious wrapped box saying a stranger had paid for everything, I knew my life would never be the same. My name is Cynthia Vance, and at 27 years old, I thought I knew exactly what my life looked like. As an active-duty soldier, I was used to high-stress situations, rigorous training, and the mental toughness required to wear the uniform. But nothing in my military training could have prepared me for the emotional ambush that was waiting for me just days before Thanksgiving. The holiday weekend was fast approaching, and I was counting down the hours until I could leave the base, drive home, and finally relax. I was looking forward to a normal civilian weekend, a warm homemade meal, the comforting smell of autumn, and the quiet relief of sleeping in my own bed next to my husband, David. But halfway through my final shift, a sudden, blinding pain tore through my abdomen. It was so intense it knocked the breath clean out of my lungs, forcing me to my knees on the cold concrete floor of the supply depot. Within an hour, the base medics realized my condition was deteriorating rapidly, and I was rushed by ambulance to the nearest civilian hospital for emergency surgery. As the medical team prepped me for the operating table, the world became a blur of bright lights, frantic whispers, and the steady, echoing beep of monitors. Right before the anesthesia took hold, the lead surgeon grabbed the desk phone to contact my next of kin. He dialed David to give him the urgent update. I was drifting under the sedation, but the room was quiet enough that the doctor's conversation echoed clearly. I watched the surgeon's expression harden into stone as my husband spoke on the other end. The doctor slowly lowered the receiver, looking at the nurse with absolute disbelief. David's exact words hung in the sterile air. "Don't bother calling unless she's dead." Lying in that recovery bed, the physical pain from the surgery was nothing compared to the cold realization settling deep in my chest. David's words didn't just hurt. They pulled back a heavy curtain on the last 3 years of our marriage. He was a successful local real estate developer, a man who knew exactly how to charm a crowd and project the image of a doting, supportive husband whenever we were out in public. But behind closed doors, a completely different reality had been playing out. Ever since I received my stationing orders at the nearby military base, a quiet resentment had taken root in him. David was used to being the center of attention, the person whose career dictated our schedule. My uniform, my commitments, and my independence threatened the absolute control he liked to maintain over our lives. He began weaponizing silence, using passive-aggressive remarks to diminish my service, and making me feel guilty for every late shift or training exercise. I had spent months making excuses for his distant behavior, telling myself he was just stressed about his property investments or lonely while I was away. But hearing his callous response to a life-threatening emergency shattered every illusion I had left. I wasn't his partner. I was a convenience he could discard the moment I required real effort or support. While I was fighting to survive on an operating table, the man who had promised to stand by me through sickness and health couldn't even bring himself to drive 20 minutes to the hospital. 2 days passed in a blur of lonely recovery. Every time the heavy wooden door to my hospital room creaked open, my heart took a nervous leap, half expecting David to finally walk in with a scripted excuse. Instead, it was only the nurses checking my vitals. I sat up in bed, staring blankly at the brick wall outside my window, my mind racing with a different kind of anxiety, the looming, out-of-network medical bills that my standard military coverage wouldn't fully oversee at this civilian facility. On the afternoon of the second day, a quiet knock interrupted my thoughts. A young hospital clerk stepped inside, carrying a small, beautifully wrapped box tied with a dark green ribbon, topped with a crisp manila envelope. She approached my bedside with a warm, gentle smile that immediately made me uneasy. "Mrs. Vance?" she asked softly, placing the package on my over-bed table. "A gentleman dropped this off for you a little while ago. He took care of everything." Confused, I reached for the envelope first. Sliding the paper out, my eyes widened as I stared at a completely itemized hospital statement. Stamped across the front in bold, unmistakable red ink was a zero balance, marked fully paid. Before I could even find the words to ask who had done this, the clerk gave a small, knowing nod. "He was very specific," she added, her voice dropping to a respectful whisper. "He said a stranger paid for everything, and he asked me to tell you this changes everything." As the clerk left, the silence in the room returned, heavier than before. With trembling fingers, I untied the green ribbon and lifted the lid of the box. Resting inside was an old, scratched military dog tag and a sleek black flash drive. With my heart hammering against my ribs, I pulled my personal tablet out of my duffel bag and plugged the black flash drive into the side port. The screen flickered, and a single folder appeared, simply labeled with my home address. My breath caught in my throat as I tapped it open, revealing a meticulously organized archive of financial documents, bank statements, and text message logs spanning the last 8 months. I scrolled through the first document, a sinking feeling taking hold of my stomach. It was a recent statement from the joint savings account I shared with David, the money I had saved from my deployments, intended for our future family. The balance had been systematically drained down to the last few dollars. David had been quietly transferring the funds into an offshore account registered under a shell company I had never heard of. Worse still, the next folder contained applications for massive business loans where David had forged my signature, attempting to use my active-duty military benefits and housing guarantees as collateral to secure his failing real estate deals. But the final item in the folder was what broke me. It was an audio file. I pressed play, and David's voice filled the quiet hospital room, sharp and entirely devoid of the warmth he used to fake. He was speaking to his hidden business partner, laying out a timeline to file for a sudden divorce while I was tied up with base duties. "Once the paperwork goes through," David sneered in the recording, "she won't have a legal leg to stand on. She doesn't even check the accounts. By the time she notices the equity in the house is gone, it'll be way too late." I leaned back against the thin hospital pillows, staring at the ceiling as the terrible reality settled in. David's dismissive words to the emergency room staff hadn't just been a display of cruelty. They were a calculated part of a plan to abandon me completely. The heavy door to my room creaked open again, breaking the stunned silence. I quickly closed the tablet screen as Dr. Thomas Mercer, the lead surgeon who had operated on me, walked in for his rounds. He checked the monitors, noting my vitals with a professional focus, but his eyes kept drifting toward the bedside table where the old, scratched military dog tag sat next to the empty wrapped box. He set his chart down, and a gentle, weary smile replaced his clinical expression. "I see you received the delivery, Cynthia," he said softly. I looked from the dog tag to the man who had saved my life just 48 hours prior. "It was you," I whispered, the pieces finally starting to click together in my mind. "You're the one who cleared the entire bill."
"But why?"
"We're strangers." Dr. Mercer took a deep breath, looking down at his hands before meeting my gaze. "We aren't entirely strangers," he explained, his voice steady but tinged with an old, lingering pain. "Years before I went to medical school, my family ran a small farming business outside the city. Your husband, David, was the developer who targeted our land. He used predatory contracts, fabricated documents, and aggressive legal threats to completely defraud my parents out of everything they owned. The stress broke my father's health." He paused, looking at the dog tag. "When I called your next of kin from the operating room and heard David's voice, I recognized it instantly. And when he told me not to call back unless you were dead, I realized he was doing to you exactly what he did to my family. I couldn't stop him back then, Cynthia. But I can ensure he doesn't destroy you now." Armed with the devastating evidence on the flash drive and backed by the legal counsel of Dr. Mercer's family attorney, I spent my final day in the hospital finalizing a battle plan. I arranged to be discharged quietly, catching a ride back to our suburban home under the pretense that I was still heavily medicated, weak, and buried under a mountain of out-of-network hospital debt. When I unlocked the front door, the house was quiet. David was sitting in the living room, a glass of bourbon in his hand, looking up with a start. The color instantly drained from his face when he saw me standing there, fully alert and steady on my feet. He had assumed I would be incapacitated, too overwhelmed by medical bills to notice the trap he had set. "Cynthia," he stammered, quickly trying to assemble his usual mask of false concern. "You're back," the hospital said. "I know exactly what you hoped the hospital would say, David," I interrupted, my voice cutting through the room like ice. I walked over to the coffee table and dropped the printed financial records, the forged loan documents, and the transcript of his recorded phone conversation right in front of him. His smug expression completely shattered as he looked down at the paperwork. He opened his mouth to lie, but I didn't give him the chance. "Dr. Mercer sends his regards," I said calmly. "Here are your options. You will sign a swift, uncontested divorce giving me full ownership of this house and the restoration of every dollar you stole from our joint savings. Or, my attorney hands this file to the military police and the civilian authorities for grand larceny and wire fraud before sunset." David stared at me, trembling as he realized his entire financial empire was just a house of cards that I now controlled. The legal separation moved with blinding speed, leaving David completely exposed. Without my active-duty housing guarantees and the savings he had stolen to prop up his failing ventures, his real estate empire collapsed into total bankruptcy. I returned to the military base with a profound sense of independence and strength, forever grateful for the unexpected ally who had handed me the keys to my own freedom. Now, I'm curious about your thoughts on my story. What would you have done if you discovered a partner's secret betrayal during a severe medical crisis? Would you have walked away quietly or fought back the way I did? Let me know your thoughts by leaving a comment below. If you want to see how other stories of unexpected justice turn out, make sure to click on one of the 2 videos popping up on your screen right now. Thank you so much for watching until the very end.